Welcome into the Crypto Bunker podcast. Um, we are looking at a lot of red recently in the markets. And so I just wanted to jump on and give my 2 cents. I think that looking at something like ETH Bitcoin, it I think it can help us potentially to identify where we are in the cycle and in the market. So it's important. I think that a lot of people are forgetting about it right now. I think obviously Benjamin Cowan talks about it, but he's very much of the opinion of the school that ETH Bitcoin will bleed off the next 6 weeks or so. It always, quote unquote, bleeds off in December unless we're sort of at the end of a bull or which is interesting. So. But just looking at it, I just wanted to cover this because I think that, it's interesting that ETH Bitcoin is making its third higher low. Um, and obviously we made a major, major low. And we're almost 100% up from where we were at the tariff crash. So if you think about like if you had bought the ETH bottom of the April crash and you bought the Bitcoin bottom, ETH has outperformed Bitcoin since then by probably about 80% or 90% or so. And so Bitcoin currently is at basically the 150-week SMA. And traditionally, this means that, essentially the bull market is over. We couldn't hold the 100-week, which has been acting as support pretty consistently since the start of the bull market. And so now most people think that, we're headed into a bear market, pretty much. I mean, it's interesting how the consensus flips. I would say the consensus was actually that the 4-year cycle is broken. Although I'm not on crypto Twitter, so use that as a caveat. But every YouTube podcast I listen to in the last month or two has said, we are we're going to break the 4-year cycle and we're going to go higher in 2026, and that's really when the actual bull market will start. And then I would say now that we have crashed, most people are sort of giving up. They're capitulating that view that they may have had, and they're capitulating that view and they're saying, well, actually, it's over. We're going into crypto winter. I'm going to sell the next rally, all of that type of stuff, right? So I'm sure you're hearing that a lot if you're watching this video. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a different perspective, not saying that any of this is financial advice, not saying I'm going to be right about anything or anything like that. But I would say, if you look at a long-term trend line on Bitcoin, so let's sort of take it back as far as we really can, almost. So from 2015 onward, and sort of trying at least to create a trend line that incorporates all of the lows that we've seen, and let's try to look at where that puts us. And I would say we're pretty much right at that point. And it's difficult to hear. I know a lot of people, may think differently, but you have to account for, all the different, as many lows as you can get in this trend line. And I know that it's not perfect in this area. So what I'm seeing is that we are basically at that low point. You can also look at the RSI and just kind of the weekly RSI in Bitcoin, and you can see that it's one of the lowest points ever. And actually, essentially, it's the same RSI as it was at the COVID crash. And I would say this is somewhat similar to that. It's not perfect, but we've gone through a cycle pretty quickly. And I would say that a lot of these are false highs. You can see the RSI obviously was the highest after the ETF, the ETF rally, March of 2024. And basically, right now it's something that it will be unprecedented if we go into a bull market from here. But theoretically, and we're at the bottom of this logarithmic chart. I also want to go to the Bitcoin rainbow chart just to see where we're at there, because I really think we're probably at the literal bottom of this. I haven't looked at it in a couple days or maybe a week or something. But when we look at the original Bitcoin rainbow, which I like better for some reason, it just seems to look better to me. We are at the level of fire sale, I guess currently. But we're pretty close to Bitcoin is dead. We're pretty close to, that sort of level of capitulation. So if you really believe that we're going into a bear market, you would have to believe that essentially the rainbow chart, will die. Or maybe you just think, well, we'll go to 70K or something. But that's not really that far away from here. So if you think we're going into this like deep bear market that we always go into, right? Every 4 years we go into this bear market. So if you think we're going into that, you would have to think that the rainbow chart and the logarithmic chart and the network effects of Bitcoin and essentially everything, you would have to give up. You would have to give it all up for that. And I just don't think that that's where we're at. And I think that there's a possibility that this is a pico bottom moment, just like the COVID crash. And honestly, it sort of makes sense. Now, follow me here. I'm going to try something that might be a little bit, different than what you maybe are used to seeing. But, I let me just move this around here. I know it's not going to be exact because the COVID crash was so big, but what if this is kind of that same or that similar type of moment? Is it going to go to 44K? No, like that's not really the correct drawing here. But what you can see, and I'll just put it sort of below it here. But what you can see is essentially this flag pattern that we saw in Bitcoin, really around December 24 through March, into the crash, into the tariff crash. The tariff crash for Bitcoin wasn't terrible, actually. It really wasn't a crash because we really corrected down to what, the 100-week SMA. And so, to me, this flag, there's a potential that this was really this area, and then this was just a false rolling high, which is sort of like this. It was kind of a fake out, but it was a longer fake out. And then we get the capitulation crash for 2020. So, let's just think about that as a possibility. And let's just say maybe, just maybe, that we're getting something that we could say, okay, here's a comparison that we can look at. And again, it's not going to be perfect. It's really not. But you can start to see it as I kind of extend this out. You can begin to see what I'm talking about, right? you can see it. You can see it here, rally, bull, fake high, crash, then starts the actual bull, right? Now, we would have to have a pretty quick recovery um, to get back there, but people are sitting on a lot of cash. It depends. I think in the first quarter of next year, Hedgeye has projected a quad one. Right now, we're sort of in a quad four, which is basically when these types of assets are crashing. And Bitcoin usually leads the charge on that. But if I think in the first quarter, we're going to be going into a regime of lower inflation and higher growth, which is like Goldilocks, essentially, right? Everything goes up in that scenario. So that would really put us at a high around January of 2027 at 300K. Am I saying that's going to happen? Not really. But I am saying that this crash to me is similar to, I mean, it's okay. It is similar a little bit to down here, but it's kind of a flash crash. It's a little bit more similar to the COVID crash, I would say. And I think a huge problem for Bitcoin, though, is MicroStrategy. MicroStrategy right now is looking very much like it did at this time, which was not a low. It was a fake out. It was, everyone sells that, and then we go to 100 probably in the future if we're going into a bear. And I think that this is a huge problem. And, will Michael Saylor sort of get bailed out by the market? I mean, all of his stupid products that he brought on as a digital credit or whatever. I mean, it's just the whole thing. It's a Ponzi scheme. I think it's a Ponzi scheme at this point. At this point, it wasn't before. I truly believe that it is now. And I'm sorry, I know that there's a lot of people out there who disagree. I mean, this is the lowest RSI that MSTR has ever had. When you look at it, since they bought Bitcoin, essentially. So I don't know what's going to happen to these stupid DAT companies. I wish they didn't exist. I honestly think that they weigh the market down because the price is supported by debt. The price is supported by this low leverage or whatever you want to call it. But either way, it's supported by debt. So what happens is people then buy that debt, but then they hedge. So they're hedging their bets. And I just think it just weighs down the innovation and the potential of these assets. Now let's cover what I believe will become the the biggest asset in crypto in the future, and that is Ethereum. And most people will laugh at that, I guess. But again, I'm trying my best with this trend line. I do think that's the best that I can get to try to cover. But we on this trend line, we hit July 17, September 17, we broke through it in September 18, we tested it. June 19, we broke out from it. December 20, we tested it all through this bear market, I would call. And now we're testing it again. And can we make a higher low there? We need to, we really need to. And ETH is getting close to its 200-week moving average. And, the moving averages for ETH are a lot skinnier than Bitcoin because ETH has just been in this like perpetual bear market. But, I think Ethereum, it still hasn't made a low compared to, this low in June of 2025. Bitcoin right now is testing its lows of the April tariffs. This one is not even testing the lows of June 2025. So what is that really telling us? In the midst of this complete capitulation, that ETH is actually holding up pretty well compared to Bitcoin. What is that trying to tell us? That's kind of what I'm trying to figure out right now. And to me, ETH is also forming um, a reverse head and shoulders potential. So you see this has a shoulder and then a big head there, and now a shoulder again. So, and then you would essentially take this and you would move it um, to be like there, essentially. And that takes us to, I mean, I'll even be conservative, but again, that's around 12K. And I don't know when this will happen, so please don't, whatever. But I do think that, you know, you can also look at ETH in a few different ways. I have a bunch of different comparisons that I've been looking at. One that I have liked a lot is actually the Russell 2000. So let's just go to the Russell. And again, this is essentially what I believe is going on. Now we've had our COVID crash in the small caps, right? We've had our COVID crash. You can look at this compared to COVID, or not even COVID, right? Because the Russell has crashes like this a decent amount, just like ETH. It's very similar to ETH. But if you look at it here, right, in 2016, February of 2016, you can see that essentially we had a big crash. And I think that that's kind of the comparison that I'm seeing here. Um, and so I try to use this on Ethereum, and you can see that it's similar. It's always kind of acting a little bit similar. But let's just actually look at the Russell here. Why is the Russell up 2.5% today? And the stock market is not, up 0.8%. What's going on there? And why are we like basically above the 20-week SMA in the Russell, in the small caps? I believe it's because we're at the beginning of a bull market. And the end of this bear market for the Russell and for Ethereum was the April lows. That's like the COVID lows. Okay. So, that was kind of what I was trying to argue for ETH. And ETH got caught up in this kind of capitulation. But you can see a similarity in the COVID crash for ETH. It was kind of there, right? And this correction that happened back in September 2020, it wasn't picked up by the 20 week at all. And so that's a problem. But I do still think there's some similarities with that Russell chart that I showed you. And so that's kind of where I'm at with it. I think that there's a possibility of that still. There's also this chart that I look at, which is the Nasdaq from back in the 90s, I believe, or the 80s. It could be. It's like very early, and basically this is the beginning when the Nasdaq started trading. And we can see it's very similar. I could make this even more exact, honestly. But basically where we could be at is where this correction comes in here. It's not going to be exact. I get it. It's, crypto has liquidations and all that, but that volatility there and then coming up to a new high and then correcting back, but making a higher low, which I think ETH is doing now, could be a good sign. So I'm actually optimistic. I think this is a buying opportunity, and it's not financial advice, but I do think that ETH is, and let's look at ETH Bitcoin before we finish here. So ETH Bitcoin, again, it's doing really well. It's above it's actually testing the 200-week moving average. And to me, it looks like it's like due for a sort of like a breakout even, because it's squeezing between these two moving averages. So it's either going to break down or it's going to break up. To me, it looks like more like a bull flag rather than a bear flag. It's kind of like this channel that we're in that's going down. And so to me, the channel, it doesn't look as bearish as like, past sort of situations with ETH Bitcoin, right? So what I could say is I actually think that we're somewhere in this area here, where again, it was December 2020. So I'm comparing where we're at now to sort of like 2020, but just more extreme, obviously, for Bitcoin and things like that. And I am worried about Bitcoin, and it sucks that ETH has to be tied to Bitcoin so much in these scenarios. But I think that ETH will lead us out more than Bitcoin will. That's my opinion. I think that the Clarity Act, the Market Regulatory Act, all that is essentially all good for ETH, and Bitcoin already has established all that. So none of that matters for Bitcoin as much. It might matter a little bit, and people know more about that. But I do think that this is similar to 2020. And let's just say it's January, let's just say it's 2021 or the last bear. I just don't see the similarities really. Um, it just doesn't seem like that's where we're at in the cycle, right? To me, it seems like, again, the final capitulation of the bear market for ETH was April 2025. And now we're kind of coming out of that. And I don't really think that Bitcoin ever went through a true um, bear or bull, basically, at all, because it didn't even touch the top of this trend line. So right now we're at the bottom of the trend line. So, good luck out there. And hopefully this helps a little bit to give people um, some thoughts that are positive at this time. That's really hard. So thank you.